Now we pick up with justification, and what we want to do is we want to look at this judicial language of the Bible, and we want to understand how the Bible itself uses this language so that we can understand properly what God Himself is trying to teach us. And we understand this language through the Hebrew and, of course, the Greek in the New Testament. Now, to recall and to remember what has been said in the past, this judicial language of the Bible is summed up in the understanding that all of us, each one of us individually, will be brought before the divine tribunal. We will all be judged according to God's justice. Now, again, this language of judiciary language is the language that comes from the Old Testament. It comes to us in specifically these words of mishpat and shafat. In these two words, we understand both the verbal action and the noun. The shafat is this Hebrew verb which means to judge. Now, the noun mishpat means judgment. Now, these are not human judgments, these are God's judgments. These judgments enact the administration of God's commandments in how individuals are called to relate to one another in love. For they are all to love one another as God has loved them. Now, under the Old Testament, judges are placed into an office of judge, in order to make righteous judgments that are in accordance with the revealed will of God as found in the written law of God. When one transgresses the judgments of God, the transgressor is condemned by the law. He is found guilty of breaking God's law. Therefore, the Old Testament tribunals were set in place to teach us about the divine tribunal, that God Himself is ultimately the judge of all creation. All humanity will be brought before the divine tribunal, as we learn in Hebrews chapter 9. It is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. In the book of Deuteronomy, the understanding of judging and judgment is made clear. The prophet Moses writes to the Israelites under the Old Testament, saying this in Deuteronomy 16. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. You shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, Moses also says in Deuteronomy chapter 25, if there is a dispute between men and they come into judgment, that is, ha-mishpat, and the judges, that is, the ushafatum, decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. Now here in Deuteronomy chapter 25, we want to notice the judicial language of shafat and mishpat, that is, judge and judgment. The judge brings judgment. Furthermore, we note the judicial language of acquitting the innocent on the one hand and condemning the guilty on the other hand. First, the Hebrew verb for acquit is sadak, which means to pardon, to set free, to remove guilt. In the hifal form of the Hebrew verb, it is causative. Thus, he is caused to be pardoned. He is caused to be free from guilt. The Hebrew noun for innocent is sadik, or commonly translated as righteous. Therefore, to acquit the innocent is to justify him. He is declared righteous. The guilt has been removed. Second, the Hebrew verb for condemn is rasha, which means to be wicked. Now, the hifil form of the verb is causative. Thus, he is pronounced guilty. He is declared to be wicked. The Hebrew noun for wicked is rasha. He is wicked, that is, guilty as charged. The same understanding of this judicial language is used by the Apostle Paul. He does this in his first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 4. Paul writes and he says, "But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purpose of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God." Now, in this passage, first, notice that the apostle declares that the Lord is the judge of all. It is the Lord who is to judge Paul. Therefore, others cannot judge Paul based upon their own opinions. Even Paul cannot judge himself. For Paul says that even if he is not aware of anything against himself, it does not mean that he can pardon himself. Paul uses the Greek verb dikaiao, which means to acquit, to pardon, to remove guilt, or to justify. In conclusion, when we use the Hebrew verb zadak and the Greek verb dikaiao, we need to understand the meaning from the Bible in judicial language. To justify means to acquit, to pardon, to set free, or to remove guilt. This language that the Apostle Paul used comes from the established understanding of judges and judgments in the Old Testament. Now, let us take a look at the book of Genesis. In chapter 44, Joseph was exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh. He brought charges against his brothers, claiming that they had his silver cup in their possession. They were not aware of this act of stealing. They claimed to be innocent. However, The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The evidence was brought before them. Judah spoke to Joseph in behalf of the brothers. The prophet Moses writes in chapter 44, Judah said, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we pardon ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he, also in whose hand the cup has been found." In this passage, the Hebrew verb tzadak is used for pardoning. Judah knows that they stand guilty before Joseph. The wicked doer cannot be pardoned. The evidence condemns him. Now, likewise, Moses writes in Exodus chapter 33, saying this, "You shall not pervert the judgment due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the blameless and righteous. For I will not acquit the wicked, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts those who are righteous." In this passage, Moses talks about the judgment, that is, the mishpat. The poor are to be given justice. The righteous, that is, the tzaddik, these are not to be put to death because they are innocent. The judges are to defend the innocent and uphold the law of God. They shall not pervert justice or subvert the cause of the righteous, that is, the tzaddik. Thus, the wicked, that is, the rasha, will not be acquitted, which is the Hebrew verb tzaddik. The judgments of God do not pardon the guilty. When King Solomon prayed at the dedication of the temple, he prayed to the Lord that justice and righteousness would prevail in the land flowing forth from the temple. Solomon prayed in 1 Kings chapter 8, "If a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath, and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants," condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness. Now, in this passage, once again, the Hebrew verb for judge is shaphat. Solomon is asking the Lord to be the judge and to judge his servants when there is a dispute between them. In other words, when one man fails to love his neighbor as he should, he has sinned against his neighbor. Solomon desires justice, which is the proper administration of God's judgments in the way in which each person is to interact with each other. God's holy judgment condemns the guilty and acquits the innocent. The Hebrew verb for condemn is rasha, and the Hebrew noun for the guilty is rasha. Thus, the wicked are those who stand condemned before God. The Hebrew verb for vindicate is sadak, which means to pardon, to set free, to remove guilt. The Hebrew noun for righteous is tzaddik. The righteous are innocent before God. Solomon is asking the Lord to give to the innocent in accordance with his innocence. He is not the guilty one. The guilty one should receive in accordance with his wickedness. In the above passages, we learn about making a holy judgment between two parties. One is found guilty and the other is found innocent. In this way, justice flows forth here on earth. However, when each of us individually stands before the judgment of God, we are those who stand accused of sin. We are the guilty party who has sinned against God. Therefore, the prophet David teaches us to pray in Psalm 143. Enter not into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. Again, the Hebrew noun for judgment is mishpat, and the Hebrew verb for righteous is sadak. David teaches us that no one will be declared righteous, that is, free from guilt in God's sight in the judgment. All have sinned and stand condemned before the law of God. The law cannot justify the ungodly. The law accuses the guilty. However, Jesus came to take the judgment of God away. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 3, "For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." Now, to be justified in God's sight is to be pardoned and acquitted of the charges of the law. The law cannot pardon. Only Jesus can justify. Thus, Paul teaches in the same chapter, "For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." You see, we cannot be justified by our own efforts. We can only be justified